everyone. Okay, these are working, perfect. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. My name is Ruth Vasilis, and I am the president of York's Drug Science Society, and along with York's Biosciences Society, we're so thrilled to be putting on this event tonight. For many people in the room, this is a speaker who needs no introduction, and for others, this will be the first time that you have the privilege of being introduced to a spectacular human mind and soul. So we are so excited to be able to put this event on for you tonight. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. Dr. Sheldrake is a biologist and an author who has written over 100 technical papers in addition to 9 books, one of which is Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, his most recent book, which has an amazing chapter on psychedelics and mind-altering substances and gives some of the scientific, the historical, and the spiritual context for them. So we highly recommend it. Dr. Sheldrake got his degrees at Cambridge, where he studied natural sciences, and he studied philosophy at Harvard. He has also had research fellowships with Clare College in Cambridge, in addition to with the Royal Society. He has not only been here in England, his interests scientifically and spiritually have taken him much farther, including to Malaysia, for example, where he studied rainforest ferns, to India, where he also studied tropical crops, and lived in an ashram for 2 years. And now we are very lucky that Rupert lives in London so that we could convince him to come up to York. And he is also currently a part of the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California, in addition to the Temenos Academy for Integral Studies in London. So that's enough for me. Enjoy the talk. Dr. Sheldrake will be talking to us about psychedelic experiences and what insights they can give us. So thank you so much, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Sheldrake.
Well, thank you, Ruth. Can you hear me? Yes, good. I've been interested in psychedelic experiences for very many years. Oh.
Yeah, okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I've been interested in psychedelic experiences for very many years. I first got interested when I was about 16. I grew up in Newark, which many of you will have passed through on the train on your way to and from York, between York and London. And I was friendly with a young doctor there who worked with some psychiatrists who worked at Saxondale Mental Hospital in Nottinghamshire. And this was in the 1950s. I'm terribly old, so this was in the 1950s. And they were very, very excited by this new thing, LSD. And at that time, LSD was not illegal. It wasn't a street drug. Practically no one had heard of it. It was something that psychiatrists had been invited to investigate by doing experiments with themselves. And my friend, the doctor, Keith Campbell, was taking LSD with his psychiatrist friends in the 1950s. And there was very little background experience at that time. And I was fascinated. He told me about it, and I was really intrigued. It was about seeing whole new aspects of consciousness. He'd been educated, as I was, in the standard scientific model, the idea that consciousness is nothing but the activity of the brain confined to the inside of the head. And these experiences, for him, were mind-blowing and mind-expanding. He gave me Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, to read, which was, for me, again, a fascinating glimpse into the possibilities of consciousness, realms of consciousness which I'd never dreamed of or heard about. Before I went up to Cambridge, I had a gap year, and I was very keen on being a scientist, so I got a job in my gap year working in a pharmacology laboratory in London for a pharmaceutical company. I was a temporary lab technician. I was 17 years old. I arrived at this lab and I found out that they were doing research on LSD, and in particular with LSD in day-old chicks. They were looking for similar kinds of drugs to LSD, so they developed a screening procedure, which I was part of the lab technician team working on. And the screening procedure was, how do you know if if a chick has taken LSD or not? The answer is they had an experiment with what was called a visual cliff. They had a table, a sheet of glass going over the edge of the table. You put normal chicks on the sheet of glass, they went over, looked over the edge, and went back. The ones that had LSD carried straight on, and no doubt imagining they could fly. Well, we know that there have been many tragic deaths from people who've taken LSDs jumping out of windows thinking they could fly. The extraordinary thing is that these day-old chicks, this was the actual bioassay for LSD-like compounds. So the test was to see if any of these other compounds we were testing caused the day-old chicks to carry straight on rather than turn back when they looked over the visual cliff. It was my job to weigh out the LSD and the mescaline for these experiments. There was a little bottle, mescaline hydrochloride. I'd read Aldous Huxley. I was sort of fascinated by it. The trouble is the amount we had in the lab was based on the amount you need for day-old chicks, which need a great deal less than 17-year-old boys. So I couldn't take enough to have an actual working dose. So it was very frustrating, so near and yet so far. But I myself first took LSD in 1970 when I was in Cambridge. And it was, for me, a transformative experience. It gave me a lot of insights into the breadth and width of the mind. I'll talk a little bit more about my experiences later, but for me this was a tremendous opening up. It completely changed my view of what minds are like and what reality is like. Because I'd been educated in the standard scientific way. We live in the materialist worldview, still the basis of standard scientific education. We live in a universe made up of unconscious matter, which has no purpose or direction or meaning. Life has come about by evolution through random mutations, by chance and natural selection. Minds are nothing but the activity of brains, physical activity inside brains. And they're basically evolved to deal with practical tasks because it's all about survival value. Well, the experience of LSD was off the end of any scale that I'd been brought up with. I'd also been brought up by a Christian family and went to a Christian school, but it was off the end of any scale that I'd been brought up with in the religious area too. So it made me very interested in the nature of consciousness and what exactly is going on. And later, I worked in India in the 1970s, and of course in India there's been thousands of years of people exploring consciousness through yoga, through meditation, and the whole of Indian philosophy and religion is really based on a philosophy of consciousness and how consciousness works. So this, for me, was one reason I wanted to take a job in India, was because here was a culture where there was a much more serious discussion of the nature of consciousness, not just based on people talking in seminar rooms, but on sannyasins who'd spent years meditating in caves in the Himalayas. India's full of holy men dressed in orange robes and who meditate and pray and go on pilgrimages and so on. So when I finished my time in India, my first book was published in 1981 called A New Science of Life, in which I put forward the idea of morphic resonance, the idea of memory and nature. And in 1982, I went to California for the launch of the American edition in California. And when I was there, I entered a whole new world that I'd not known about before. I knew about the East Coast, I'd studied at Harvard, but California in the early 80s was a very exciting place to be. And one of the people I met on my first journey there was Terence McKenna. Some of you will be familiar with his work. He died, sadly and prematurely, in 2000, so 25 years ago. But Terence lives on beyond the grave through his talks on YouTube and on the internet. And he was a bardic figure who was a kind of prophet of the psychedelic movement. And he and a friend of his and mine, Ralph Abraham, who died last year, had a series from then on, from 1982 till Terence died in 2000. Every year we met for several days to discuss all sorts of ideas in three-way conversations called trialogues. 2 books came out of that, and there's at least 40 trialogues online. On my website, there's a whole trialogue section. And in these, we explored the range of consciousness and how psychedelics could influence it. Ralph Abraham was a leader in the field of visual dynamics. He was professor of chaotic mathematics at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and was one of the first people in the field of computer graphics. And he was rather upset with me once because I sort of outed him. I inadvertently said something to a journalist about his interest in the subject. Because he told me that he thought most people who were into computer graphics in the 80s in California had got there because they were so interested in psychedelics, and they were trying to explore this through computers. And this was a sort of well-known thing. Timothy Leary once said that people went to India for meditation, etc., but people from all around the world came to California for the psychedelics and the experience of psychedelics. People from Japan were going there so they could keep up with the Americans in computer science. A skeptical journalist interviewed Ralph Abraham about this, and she didn't really believe him. So she went to the SIGGRAPH, the Computer Graphics Convention in Silicon Valley in the 1980s, and she interviewed 180 people there, saying, did they take psychedelics and had it played a part in their interest in computer graphics? Out of 180 people she asked, 180 answered yes. So this was a time in California when psychedelics were being explored in a way that fertilized the Hollywood film industry. There was a lot of interest from Hollywood people. And at the Esalen Institute in California, there were a series every year conferences on psychedelics, which I had the good fortune to be able to go to. One of the people who spoke at them was Sasha Shulgin, who was one of the ultimate designers of designer drugs. He's the person who resurrected MDMA, or ecstasy, which had been discovered in the 1920s, but no one had ever done anything with it. And no one had taken it, and he discovered its amazing properties. And I was part of the first cohort of people who tried this out. And at that time, it was seen as, it wasn't illegal. No one had heard of it. It was, the main interest, as with LSD, was from psychiatrists and psychotherapists who realized that this reduced the feeling of fear, people's hearts opened, and it was used in psychotherapy and was extremely effective. None of us thought at that time that it would sort of escape from the world of psychotherapy and become a primary driving force of the rave scene, but that's what happened. And then some people died because of taking it, and it was made illegal. And it's only now that there's a resurgence of research on MDMA and its possible roles in psychotherapy. There was then a period when all research on psychedelics was banned. The only person who was able to work in that period was Rick Strassman, who's a friend of mine, and who was able to do a whole research project on the very powerful psychedelic DMT, dimethyltryptamine, at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. And Rick, for some reason, was able to do this when no other research was allowed. But as you know, within the last 10 years or so, there's been a resurgence of research on psychedelics. One of the leading people in Britain, Amanda Fielding, she's always been interested in psychedelics, but she managed to get this research legalized, partly because she's married to the with the Earl of Weems. She's a countess. She has a beautiful country house near Oxford. And she was very skillfully found that she could invite professors from Oxford and ministers from London to dinner at her wonderful house, Beckley Park. And very few people refuse an invitation from a countess to a beautiful house with a wonderful dinner. And so with social skills, charm, and total honesty, she was one of the people who managed to get the psychedelic research legalized again, because she was convinced that this wasn't just something of curiosity, a curiosity value for a small number of people, but could have enormous therapeutic potential. And there's now, as you all know, a great deal of research on psychedelics and their therapeutic effects. And that's why here at the University of York there's a drug science society. There wouldn't have been a drug science society, at least not interested in psychedelics, 20 years ago. Well, the very word psychedelic, as I'm sure most of you know, means psyche revealing. And this name was given to them because the Humphrey Osmond, who was a friend of Aldous Huxley, who was a psychiatrist in Canada, thought this was a very good name for them because they tell us something about the nature of the mind or the psyche. They reveal something about the nature of the psyche. They give us insights into the psyche and how it works. And this has become part of a field of science which has now been going for 30 years, namely consciousness studies. When I was studying at Cambridge as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, consciousness was simply not discussed by anybody. The dominant school in psychology in most of the 20th century in the English-speaking world was behaviorism. And behaviorism said that the only scientific approach to the mind was to say that consciousness didn't exist, or at least it was irrelevant, because it's subjective and therefore unscientific. And the only kind of research that was allowed was measurable behavior, which usually boiled down to rats pressing levers to get pellets of food as rewards. And so it was only muscular activities and glandular secretions that could be measured. So there was no study of consciousness at all in many psychology departments. And then that was replaced by cognitive science, which was all about the brain as a computer and the algorithms that go on inside the brain to process information. So it was a radical breakthrough when consciousness studies became an academically respectable subject. And this was partly because Francis Crick, who was a hardcore materialist and a militant atheist, thought that the last frontier for science was consciousness, that science could never be complete unless it had explained consciousness. And he felt that by studying consciousness from a scientific point of view, he thought when he first took this up, within 10 or 20 years, the whole thing would be solved. The whole problem of consciousness would be solved, and then the last stronghold of mysticism, religion, superstition, and the rest of it would fall, vanquished by rational materialist science. However, although he helped found consciousness studies, he didn't live to see consciousness explained, and indeed it's still not explained, which is why in the philosophy of mind the very existence of human consciousness is called the hard problem, because brains that work mechanistically just through physical and chemical processes don't give you any indication of why you should be conscious, what it's like to feel something, what it's like to experience something. And So the very existence of consciousness is called the hard problem. Some materialist philosophers try and explain it away by saying consciousness doesn't really exist at all. It's just folk psychology talking in that way, and soon, with the advances of neuroscience, we'll be able to talk about it without mentioning consciousness or subjectivity. Another group think that consciousness does exist, but that it doesn't do anything. It's an epiphenomenon, a meaningless or functionless epiphenomenon of the activity of the brain. And another school of thought say, well, consciousness does exist, but it's just an illusion produced by brain activity. Their critics point out that illusion is itself a mode of consciousness, so this doesn't really explain it. That's why it's called the hard problem, because it goes round and round in circles, and there's no way of explaining it in those terms, or at least none that most people find convincing. When consciousness studies got going, for the first time, academic scientists started looking at phenomena which had previously been ignored. These included mystical experiences. The pioneer in that was Sir Alister Hardy in Oxford, a professor of zoology, who started collecting stories from people about their mystical experiences. Most people at that time thought that mystical experiences were very rare and happened perhaps to a few medieval saints and mystics, but had died out in the modern rational world. When Hardy started appealing through newspapers and the BBC for people to write in about their mystical experiences, it opened the floodgates. Thousands of stories poured in, and he realized, and other people realized, they're actually far more common than anyone had thought. Large numbers of people have mystical experiences, sometimes spontaneously in nature, sometimes as children, they just have a sense of connection or presence of a loving being greater than themselves. Sometimes, and increasingly, through near-death experiences, where people who've nearly died feel they go to a whole other realm of existence. They typically, as many of you know, experience, some of you will have experienced it yourself, experience themselves floating out of their body, seeing themselves from above, and then going through a kind of tunnel into the light, and find themselves in a realm of love, peace, and joy, and they meet sometimes deceased relatives who come to them in a loving way, or beings of light. Hardy found that a lot of people had had these experiences, but they didn't talk to their doctors about it. This was before Raymond Moody wrote his popular book on near-death experiences and gave them the name near-death experiences. And near-death experiences are increasing in frequency because far more people now nearly die than used to. In the past, a lot of people who nearly died did die. Now with modern medicine and cardiac resuscitation and so on, a lot of people nearly die who would otherwise have died. And so near-death experiences are on the increase. More and more people have had them. And then consciousness research scientists looked at other altered states of consciousness. They paid more attention to dreaming than they had before, and particularly to states of lucid dreaming, dreams where you know you're dreaming, and also to out-of-the-body experiences, where many people have had experiences where they feel themselves going out of their body, sometimes looking back and seeing themselves, as in a near-death experience. That starts with an out-of-the-body experience. And of course, psychedelic experiences become part of this wider field of consciousness studies. The Journal of Consciousness Studies, which is an academic journal, where the first issue was published in 1994. And since then, the University of Arizona at Tucson, every 2 years, there's been a big consciousness conference, an international consciousness conference. Every other year, it's held in Europe. This year, it'll be in July in Barcelona, Spain. So these gatherings are transdisciplinary. These studies of altered states of consciousness and consciousness studies involve psychologists, philosophers, neuroscientists, anthropologists, and all sorts of religious studies people, all sorts of people who are concerned with looking at different forms of consciousness in an interdisciplinary way. Well, when we look at the investigations of psychedelics and their effects, one of the things that becomes clear is that the primary effects of many psychedelics are visual. If you think of experiences of mushrooms, LSD, and most psychedelics have a strongly visual effect. They are sometimes called hallucinogens because they create hallucinations or visionary states. Very few psychedelics, in fact, the only one that's been identified is an obscure one called di-isopropyltryptamine, have effects on auditory senses. And that's, I've never taken it, but it sounds quite horrible, its effects. Most people say it really has a really depressing effect. It gives you a horrible feeling, and it has auditory hallucinations. But nearly all of the other psychedelics are primarily visual. And many of them are synesthetic. Some people who've taken LSD, for example, find that if they hear music, the music turns into wonderful visual patterns. I've had this myself. I'm not normally synesthetic. Some people are synesthetic in ordinary life. But many people have had this experience with psychedelics. So the visual effect is one of the primary features of them. There are two major families of psychedelics, and they're both related to amino acids, which are the constituents of proteins, and to neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters, the chemicals that enable one nerve cell to influence another through a release of chemicals from the synapses across the synaptic junction. Some of them are amino acids. Glycine is one, for example. Gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, is another. But some of the neurotransmitters are simple derivatives of amino acids. Dihydroxyphenethylamine, DOPA, is one, dopamine. And another one is serotonin, which is a tryptamine compound. So there's one family of psychedelics called the phenethylamines, which are related to DOPA and to adrenaline and noradrenaline, which they're very similar to those compounds. And this family includes amphetamines, MDMA, which is a form of amphetamine, and mescaline, which is a visionary substance, the one that Aldous Huxley was mainly writing about in The Doors of Perception, that's present in the peyote cactus. The other family are the tryptamine family, of which the best known example is dimethyltryptamine, DMT. But this family also includes psilocybin, as in magic mushrooms, and LSD, which is lysergic acid diethylamide, which is, the lysergic part is ergic, comes from ergot. It's a fungal compound. It's a modification of a fungal compound, like psilocybin is a fungal compound. It's not exactly a tryptamine, but it's structurally similar to one. It works through the tryptamine system. These are both families of compounds that were investigated in detail by Sasha Shulgin, who I mentioned earlier. He wrote, his first book on these was called PIHKAL, P-I-H-K-A-L, which meant phenethylamines I have known and loved. And in it, he describes about 100 different derivatives related to mescaline, MDMA, and so on, in that family, and adrenaline. He synthesized a whole range of compounds in that family, methyl groups, ethyl groups, so he was a skilled organic chemist. And he made these new derivatives that no one had ever made before. And as he said, before anyone tried them, their psychological effects were a tabula rasa. No one knew what would happen. And the only way to find out was to try it. So he tried them himself. I mean, he's a heroic scientist. Some of them were toxic, and he tried with small doses, and he forgot about those. He didn't want to do, but some of them had very, very interesting effects. And if they were non-toxic and had benign and interesting effects, the next person to try them was his wife, Anne. And so the book's co-authored by Sasha and Anne Shulgin. And then they had a tasting panel of about a dozen people who would then try them. And they'd each describe the effects. And what came into being was a consensus view on what these did. And it didn't exist before. The only way of doing it was to find it out. And then the next level was at these conferences at the Esalen Institute, where there were about 30 or 40 people. Each year, Sasha Shulgin would say, well, I have here a new compound that we think is very promising, and if anyone, we've got a free afternoon if anyone would like to try it. So I joined in the sort of the third level or second level of the tasting panel myself. And it was indeed fascinating because this wasn't something for which there was already a standard consensus view. This is like frontiers of consciousness research. He followed up his, the book, Pico, Phenethylene I've Known and Loved, is a little bit like a cookery book because it has the chemical recipes for how to make them, lab notes, you know, do this exactly as an organic chemist would need this. And then it has tasting notes, a bit like a sort of restaurant guide, you know, or a wine guide, sort of, with, you know, mellow effects, etc. So tasting notes, and then notes on toxicity and warnings if the warnings were needed. He followed this up with another book, TCAL, Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved, which was about the tryptamine family of compounds. And if any of you are interested in, you know, just where these things would lead, all the different variations and shades of experience that are possible through these chemical molecules, these books are the invaluable reference works. So that is a way of sort of cataloguing what can happen by describing the effects. But if we then come to think about, well, what kinds of things are going on with psychedelics? Well, we know at the chemical level what's happening. The interesting thing about them is they have hugely important psychological and indeed spiritual effects, but they're also grounded in regular science and hard facts of chemistry. We know what's happening at the chemical level, which neurotransmitters they're interfering with, what their chemical structures are, what the receptors are in the synapses are like, and so on. All of this can be and has been studied scientifically. But then when we come to the question of, well, what's going on in these experiences? Why are we having these experiences? What are they like? How can we map them onto the rest of our experience? I myself think that the most helpful starting point is to think about dreams. All of us have dreams every night. Some of us don't remember them. Some people have more vivid dreams than others. People who think visually often have very vivid, visual, full-color dreams. Some people don't think very visually, they think verbally. And some people who think extreme verbal thinkers tend to have black and white dreams, and they're not particularly vivid. So there's a great difference in people's dreams. But in dreams, what we experience is a world, for most people, in full color, in 3D, in a kind of space. The dream takes place in a kind of space, but it's not the normal space of everyday life. It resembles it, but it's different space. And it's not the space we're seeing with our eyes, because when we're dreaming, our eyes are shut and we're lying asleep in bed. But in our dreams, we have another body, the dream body, which sometimes in the occult literature called the astral body. But I think it's much simpler to just think of it as what we all know, our dream body. In our dreams, we have a body We go around in our body in our dreams, we can talk to people, we can see things, sometimes we can fly in our dream body. It's not like our normal body in many ways, but it is a kind of other body, and it's the center of consciousness through which we exist in our dreams. And in our dreams, our minds create whole worlds, strange worlds, all sorts of people, beings, events, improbable things happen in them. Sometimes scary, nightmares, sometimes erotic, as in erotic dreams, sometimes puzzling or strange. And the content of the dreams is partly from our own memories, partly people we know, but sometimes things that haven't yet happened. A lot of people, when they study their dreams closely, find they're dreaming about things that happen in the next 2 or 3 days. Precognitive dreams are more common than most people imagine, and you can find out by keeping a written record of your dreams. When I did it myself, I found I was dreaming precognitively much more than I'd ever considered possible. You just forget most of your dreams, so you don't know quite what's going on. But sometimes they contain images that aren't our own personal images. And as many of you know, the psychologist Jung, C.G. Jung, thought that in our dreams we access what he called the collective unconscious, which is a collective human memory which contains the dreams and fantasies and mythological archetypes, not just of our own, but of other cultures too. And sometimes he found his Swiss patients were dreaming about archetypal forms and images that occurred in, say, African mythologies that they'd never read about and didn't know about, but were coming out through the collective unconscious. Well, I think that dreams provide a way of thinking about psychedelic experiences. It's as if psychedelic experiences are enormously intensified dreams that you don't have to be asleep to have them. You enter them from the waking state. But the same kinds of creative abilities of the mind to create a space, a visual realm, all sorts of unexpected and surprising things exist in all our minds every night whenever we dream. And I think psychedelics somehow tune into this aspect of our minds that's there anyway. They don't create it out of nothing. I think they tap into something that happens anyway through dreams. And in our dreams, we have dream bodies. We have out-of-the-body experiences in the sense the whole of a dream is a kind of out-of-the-body experience. You're not in your physical body, and yet you're doing things that are out of your physical body. Lucid dreams are a bit like waking up within the dream. And I think that psychedelic experiences also overlap with other experiences, including near-death experiences. In the 1960s, the Czech researcher Stanislav Grof did a lot of research, first in the Czech Republic and later in California. He went to the US on people taking LSD. LSD was not illegal at the time, and it was perfectly all right to do research on it. This was the same kind of period when my friends in Newark were taking LSD. Doctors and psychiatrists were taking it, young ones, and having a very, very exciting and interesting time. Stan Grof found that many people who took LSD had something very like a near-death experience. They had the experience of being in a constricted space. They felt being oppressed, crushed, trapped, a hellish state to be in, an awful feeling. And then they found themselves escaping from that stage through a tube, a dark tunnel, and coming out into the light, into a state of bliss and joy and beauty, and a sense of divine presence in many cases. About half the people he interviewed had that kind of experience. And when I first took LSD, that's exactly what happened to me. I had a kind of near-death experience. And people who have near-death experiences that from accidents and heart attacks and so on, very often say that this experience has changed their life. They're less afraid of death, they're much more interested in spiritual topics and so on. And the same thing happened to people who had these psychedelic near-death experiences in Stan Grof's study. Stan Grof was a psychologist, and in interpreting these studies, he thought that what they did was actually evoke the archetype of being born. All of us, when we were born, had an incredibly uncomfortable time. We'd had 9 months floating blissfully in amniotic fluid in our mother's womb, and everything was fine. And suddenly, we start being crushed, contractions. So we're no longer welcome there. It's a horrible place to be. We don't want to be there anymore. And the only way out is through a dark tube that comes out into the light. And so he thought that this was the archetype of the birth process. And in fact, in many mythologies, the process of death is compared to the process of birth. The womb is the tomb, is one way of putting it. And so he thought that this tuned into the archetype of the birth process. And this is like a rebirth process. And in fact, if you look anthropologically at rites of passage in many cultures, they involve a kind of death and rebirth process. They involve a process of ordeal where you undergo life-threatening situations. American Indians' vision quest involves no food, fasting, being in the wilderness in states of extreme danger. Some people die. And you come back from that journey through this wilderness, through this liminal realm where you're not part of your previous life. You're in a realm, it's dangerous, it's threatening. And then you come back and are reintegrated through a kind of rebirth into a new role in society. You've gone through a rite of passage. And I think that for many young people today, in our society that lacks rites of passage, psychedelics have taken on that role. I think it's a deeply archetypal role, and I think it's deeply archetypal in our Christian or post-Christian culture, because I think the rite of passage that's most clearly indicated in the Christian tradition is baptism. Baptism was carried out for adults, not originally, not for children. It wasn't a matter of sprinkling holy water on babies. If you think of John the Baptist in the New Testament, who baptized Jesus, John the Baptist was baptizing people on an industrial scale. People came to the River Jordan. John the Baptist was standing there in the Jordan. He held them under, and then they came up, and their lives were transformed. And I think that the simplest explanation of John the Baptist is not the conventional one. The conventional explanation is that this was symbolic of death by drowning and rebirth. Well, why have something that's symbolic when by holding them under a couple of minutes longer, you can have the real thing? I think John the Baptist was a drowner, and I think that he was actually holding people under long enough to induce a near-death experience by drowning. And people's lives were completely changed. They saw the light, they were born again. This was something that was faded out quite quickly in the history of the Christian church, but in the ferment of the Reformation, there were some groups, the Anabaptists, who later gave rise to Baptist churches, who brought back the form of baptism by total immersion. And I think that they rediscovered this principle because they went round being a terrible nuisance to the authorities, the state and the church authorities, because they went round in the 16th and the 17th century, and indeed in America still till today, saying they'd died, they'd seen the light, and they'd been born again. A perfect description of a near-death experience. And they've had this total immersion experience. Now, I suspect that today, not many people would actually go, not many Baptist ministers would go that far. We now live in an age of health and safety regulations and litigation. But John the Baptist was pre-litigation and pre-health and safety. And you know, he may have lost a few, but basically, I think that he was doing something enormously effective. And it only took a few minutes, and they were queuing up on the bank of the Jordan. I can just imagine the assistants would say, "Next, please." And it was, you could process quite a lot of people in a day. So I think this archetype of near-death experiences, death and rebirth to a new life, is something which psychedelics tap into today. I think that's one reason so many people are interested in them, and why they can have such a transformative effect. Now, when people study the effects of psychedelics, one of the things they do is disable the regions of the brain that are concerned with worry, anxiety, rumination, internal dialogue. In other words, the regions of the brain that are called the default mode network. The default mode network, because if you're not doing anything in particular, you default to this internal dialogue. And most spiritual practices are about getting out of that internal dialogue and coming into the present. Well, psychedelics actually suppress the activity of the default mode network. I mean, you can measure this. People take psychedelics in laboratories with EEG machines or in brain scanners. And this, you can actually measure this effect, that one of the things they do is suppress the default mode network. They bring you into the present. It's not the only way of suppressing it. Another way is meditation. When people meditate, one of the effects of meditation is the suppression of the default mode network, so people become much more into the present. If you're going to experience a sense of presence, mystical experiences are usually about the sense you're in the presence of a consciousness greater than your own. If you're going to come into the present, then you have to suppress the default mode network. Another way of doing it, which actually in my book, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, the first chapter is on sports as a spiritual practice, because another way of suppressing the default mode network's activity is being completely engaged in some physical activity. I had an American friend who had a very busy job, and he told me he just couldn't stop thinking. He couldn't sleep very well. He couldn't stop thinking. He tried meditation, but it just didn't work for him. But he was also a rock climber. He said by the time he was 50 feet up a rock face, he was completely in the present. The only thing that mattered is where the next finger hold was. And for him, this was a tremendous spiritual practice, and I think for many people, sports have that role in the modern world. If you're skiing downhill at 60 miles an hour, you have to be in the present. Or if you're driving a motorbike at 100 miles an hour, you have to be in the present. And I think that's why so many people in the modern world, starved of normal spiritual activities provided traditionally by religion, get them through dangerous sports and these things like driving fast or sports like skiing. And any sport, I mean, if you're in the middle of a football match and there's a crowd cheering, you have to be concentrating on where the ball is and where it's being passed, and so you can't be wondering about whether you paid the gas bill or something your girlfriend said that annoyed you or something like that. You're in the present. So certainly many spiritual practices involve coming into the present, and psychedelics, I think, act as a spiritual portal for many people, a spiritual gateway, because, like other spiritual practices, they bring us into the present. And one of the things about psychedelics, it precisely is this sense of presence. And that's why, for many people, they do have this spiritual effect. People feel that they're in the presence of a greater consciousness, a greater spiritual power. One particular psychedelic that's more or less what it does. It's the 5-methoxy-DMT, 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine, present in the Colorado River toad and the Sonoran Desert toad in the secretions on its skin, and also made synthetically, is an extremely powerful and rapid-acting psychedelic like DMT, but it's non-visual. It sort of takes people straight into almost straight into the kind of divine presence without visuals. So not all psychedelics are visual, but many of them have this effect of opening people to this sense of a much greater conscious presence. Another point I just want to, about insights from psychedelics, I want to raise is the whole question of entities, other beings. Many people who take psychedelics experience encountering beings. They can be sometimes insectoid, praying mantises, machine elves is what Terence McKenna sometimes talked about. They can be angels, they can be saints, they can be departed loved ones, they can be gods or goddesses, they can be Jesus. I mean, people encounter entities in psychedelic experiences. And again, there's a lot of talk about this at the moment. I've been to 2 symposia about entities in psychedelic experiences. One was a symposium at a country house in England called Tyringham, the Tyringham Symposium. It's published in a book now. It was just people who were invited. It wasn't a public event to discuss their experiences, who mostly experienced psychonauts. Another one happened a couple of years ago here in Yorkshire at Broughton Hall in Yorkshire, a symposium on entities. And the question was, what are they? Are there really spirit beings out there that we encounter in these altered states of consciousness, inhabit a kind of spiritual realm, which is what all shamanic societies, all religious beliefs have taken for granted over the centuries? Or are they merely products of our own imagination produced inside the brain by deranged functioning of the nervous system? Well, the materialist view is, of course, that they're produced inside the brain. They're nothing but figments of our imagination that we produce inside our heads. The other view is very unfamiliar in our culture because so many people have grown up in a secularized worldview where things like spirits and entities and angels and things just don't exist. They're just imaginary things for kids in children's stories, but adults are supposed to grow out of this sort of superstitious belief. So most people, when they encounter these beings, don't know what to think or how to relate to them. And so this is a big topic of debate within the consciousness studies world at the moment. And of course, within this world, there are divided opinions. Some psychedelic researchers are materialists, and they think that all of this is just simply telling us more about the way in which nervous cells function together in brains, and they're generating these experiences as epiphenomena that are nothing but the activity of the brain. Other people think that they really are opening us up to much wider psychic and spiritual realms. That's what I think myself. But whenever I go to meetings, sort of academic and meetings, or even things like the Tyringham or the Broughton Symposia, there are always some researchers there who are materialists who just think it just shows how wonderful the physical processes of the brain are. I saw that some of you may have seen an interesting program by Sam Harris, the noted atheist, on YouTube a year or 2 ago, where he talked about a mushroom trip he'd had. And he said how this trip had made him feel completely connected to the universe, as if he was one with all things. He could understand why mystics thought that their mind was part of a greater mind, why people thought there was God, and so on. But after a couple of days, when he thought about it, he realized this was nothing but a hallucination produced by the disturbed activity of his nervous system. Well, why would he think that? Well, because he's a materialist. And why is he a materialist? Because he thinks materialism is scientific. But actually, if you think about it, science is supposed to be based on empirical reality. Science is empirical, based on experience. And so this is a paradoxical thing, because your belief in science based on experience is denying your own experience in the name of a doctrine that says you ought to pay attention to experience, and it's all about experience. So there's a very peculiar dynamic here. And that's why psychedelics challenge so much about the materialist worldview. In fact, studies of people who've taken psychedelics show that, especially when the people who've been taking part in experiments are academics, they're part of university communities, many people who take them, when they take them as part of the study, when they go into the experience, classify themselves as atheists. After the experience, when they're fill in questionnaires, the number of atheists plummets. So psychedelics actually can transform people's worldview, because atheism is usually associated with materialism, the idea there's nothing beyond the brain and unconscious matter. And so they can lead to a spiritual opening. Now, some people will lament this. They'll think they're just creating delusions and they're dangerous from that point of view. Others may welcome it, but it's a fact that it changes people's attitude very radically. Not in all cases, but in many cases. When Rick Strassman did his studies on the effect of DMT, he did follow-up studies a year or two later, and he found that about a third of the people who had DMT, very powerful experiences with it, had actually undergone a great change in worldview, but about 2/3 hadn't. They'd just gone back, after a few days, they'd just gone back to business as usual and said that it was an interesting experience, it was another trip, it was just an experience. So it doesn't always work that way. It depends on where you're coming from, what state you're in, and so on. But the fact is that psychedelics have been an important part of many religious traditions from the earliest times. In India, the earliest book we have of the Indian corpus is the Rig Veda. And the Rig Veda contains numerous hymns to a brew called Soma, which was a psychedelic brew. No one knows what it was. Of course, there's endless speculation. But it talks about Soma in terms that make it very clear that this was changing people's consciousness and was one of the foundations of the Hindu interest in consciousness. And one of the hymns in the Rig Veda translated says, "The Soma is full of intelligence. It inspires man with enthusiasm. It makes the poets sing. We have drunk the Soma. We have come to be immortal. We have arrived at the light. We have reached the gods." Among the ancient Greeks, one of their great things was the Eleusinian Mysteries, where they went into a temple in the dark. They drank a brew, and the brew was a transformative thing for them. They then came out into the light, and they said they died and they'd been reborn. No one knows what was in the brew. Some people speculate it was based on ergot, containing something like LSD, which they'd found a way of purifying to get the toxic compounds out of. But that's pure speculation. Shamanic cultures often use psychedelics, and this was one of the things Terence McKenna was keenest on, the anthropology of shamanic psychedelics like ayahuasca. And a more recent evolution are psychedelic Christian churches, which in Brazil, one of the leading ones is Santo Daime, a church which is now legal in Brazil and now widespread all around the world. There are underground cells here in Britain, where ayahuasca is taken as a Christian sacrament. And in the last 2 years, a new organization called Ligare, the Christian Psychedelic Association, is experimenting with psychedelic Christian retreats and as an opening to the spiritual realm within a Christian framework. There's a rapid evolution culturally going on of psychedelics at the moment. We're changing over at the moment from the dominance of the materialist paradigm to a much more holistic and interconnected worldview. And psychedelics are very much part of that change, both collectively, culturally, and individually. And I think the insights they offer us can indeed be transforming, both individually and collectively. And I think we're just at the beginning of this process of transformation at the moment. Thank you.
Is this, yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much, Rupert, for an amazing talk. I think I will start off by asking a question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you want to kind of get your question in your mind, and then we'll have somebody run a mic to anyone who would like to ask one. But following up just on where you left us on talking about the evolution of religion and psychedelics, I was wondering if you have any predictions on whether there will be more organizations like Ligare, and maybe you can speak a little bit about Ligare, or how you see psychedelics perhaps interacting with monotheistic religions as we know them today.
Well, I think that's a very important question. There's an underground movement some of you may have encountered called Cathedrals on Cannabis, which is about people who visit the great cathedrals in an altered state of consciousness. And of course, this Cathedrals on Cannabis has led to smaller movements, cathedrals on mushrooms, cathedrals on acid, and so on. But cathedrals were built in the Middle Ages literally to expand consciousness. They're so much bigger than they need to be as a functional space just for people to gather. They're built to expand minds, with stained glass windows. And imagine in the Middle Ages, people lived in mud huts, and so on. Going into a cathedral like York Minster, and with those stained glass windows, it was a completely mind-opening experience. And I think that the one way in which they can interact with existing religions is through the tradition and the architecture. I mean, York Minster is, as many of you will know, the most wonderful building. And this evening with Ruth, I went to choral evensong there. Every day at 5:30, there's this incredibly beautiful service, different singing every day, sacred chant echoing in that space. We didn't go on cannabis, mushrooms, or acid. Hasten to add, nothing more than a cup of tea beforehand. But I can speak from experience that experiencing our cathedrals in an altered state of consciousness is a most amazing thing. And what it does is connects one with the fact that the people who built these mysticism was common. Middle Ages was full of monasteries, monks, convents, contemplators, hermits. Every county had hermits and living in caves and hermitages, and anchorites living in cells and things, like Julian of Norwich, in Norwich. So it was a mystical time, and the architecture that expressed that was these great cathedrals. And I think that the rose windows and the stained glass and all that is actually a reflection of altered states of consciousness that people took more or less for granted then. It informed this architecture. And it can come to life again in a new way if one actually opens oneself to it in an altered state of consciousness. But of course, you have to behave responsibly and don't do this if you don't know how to sort of conduct yourself in public in an altered state of consciousness. And I should also add a disclaimer. I'm not advocating that everyone takes psychedelics. For some people, they're dangerous. I have a nephew who's a psychiatric nurse based in Wells near Glastonbury. And every year, he's one of the people who has to pick up the pieces after the Glastonbury Festival, because there are always some people who've taken psychedelics that have pushed them into a psychotic episode. So this is a real danger. They're powerful, and it's because they're so powerful that they can have destructive and harmful effects on some people some of the time. But I think that the interaction between psychedelics and the established religions is a very interesting thing. It's happening with these movements within Christianity. There are some people in Istanbul, in Sufi groups, who are now experimenting with ayahuasca. They've connected with some of these Christian ayahuasca groups. And Islam on the whole isn't very friendly to altered states of consciousness, although they've always had cannabis as part of their culture. But the Sufis are more exploratory and mystical than most Muslims. And of course, in Hinduism, altered states of consciousness are just normal. They're just part of the whole way of being. So I think they're the ones who probably know most about this at the moment. Except they haven't explored ayahuasca, which is a South American brew. I think what makes this present state of spiritual evolution so interesting is that never before have all the world's spiritual traditions come into contact or interaction with each other as they are doing today. And so people in South America, some of them in the Amazon region were taking ayahuasca. In Mexico, some were taking sacred mushrooms. In southern parts of the US, peyote cactus. In Africa, iboga, which is widely used in therapy for addiction or depression. So I think this is a whole area of exploration. And one reason why these therapeutic substances work so well for addiction and depression is precisely because they open people to the spiritual dimension. It's not just a chemical effect on chemicals in the brain, it's the experience itself, which is the therapeutic part of their remarkable effectiveness in overcoming mild or moderate depression or even deep depression and some addictions.
Thank you so much, Rupert. My takeaway from that is that our next evening song might be more colorful. But anyway, does anybody from the audience have any questions? Yeah, okay. Right here, let's see if we can pass you a mic.
Thank you. Rupert, I had a moment of precognition in all of that, but then I wondered if it was a moment of morphic resonance, and it was when you brought C.G. Jung into the conversation and you talked about the archetype of birth. I wondered, because I was thinking about Jung, and then later on it set me on a train of thought, is what you referred to as a psychotic episode, I think, and what commonly might be known as a bad trip. Is there something of the coming face to face in a bad trip with the Jungian archetype of the shadow? That's kind of my question, really. Is that the crux of a bad trip, is the shadow coming face to face with the...
Bad trips, I just don't know whether it's... I think there's different kinds of bad trips. I mean, a lot of bad trips are about people feeling they're losing control, and that they're... When I had my own really bad experience the first time I took LSD, I just thought I'd gone mad. I thought I was trapped and I'd never recover from this state. I thought I was trapped in hell. And I suppose that's the kind of shadow, the hell, it represents the kind of shadow or symbolizes it. And I think some people where they're nightmare-like experiences, which are usually about being trapped or pursued or captured or encased. Or, well, I think Stan Grof was a kind of Jungian, and he thought that this enclosure, this being trapped, which he equated with the archetype of being the womb, the contractions of the womb at the end of pregnancy. He thought that was one of the main sources of bad trips. But I suppose that for people, anyone who has sort of persistent fears or worries or stuff, it can exaggerate that, and some people can become paranoid, for example. I think it basically is a matter of exaggerating whatever it is that one's afraid of or whatever one's own shadow is. I'm not sure that there's a one-size-fits-all explanation. But I haven't actually studied the bad trips in any detail. I must admit I've been more interested in the positive sides. But I think I'll ask my nephew, who's the psychiatric nurse and who's dealt with a lot of psychotic episodes from drugs. Next time I see him, I'll ask him and I'll try and find out more, because he's actually had a lot of experience of this.
Great. I think right there with the stars.
Hello, thanks. I'm just intrigued by what you just said about having had a bad trip on LSD, how you had the guts, so to speak, to, it sounds like, do it again, but that's not my question. I'm interested in terminal lucidity, paradoxical lucidity, and how you think that might relate. You know, when people are near death, at the end of their life, or after, you know, maybe severe brain damage, maybe Alzheimer's, then
Yes.
seem to come back to sort of being very wise, sort of hyper-aware, and yeah, in a kind of marvelous sort of way. How you think that might relate?
Well, I don't have a very short answer for that, but I'll try and summarize it. For those who are not familiar with terminal lucidity, it's a phenomenon that occurs sometimes with people who've had Alzheimer's or dementia, who haven't recognized anyone for years, who don't know what's going on. A few hours or days before they die, they become clear, they know they're dying, they know who people are, they remember things, they're completely present, and then they die. That's why it's called terminal lucidity. Well, I think there are several interesting things about this. First, it shows that the memories are not stored inside the brain, because if they'd been abolished by Alzheimer's, they wouldn't be able to get them back again. This is part of a wider, I didn't talk this evening about my own hypothesis of morphic resonance, which is an influence of memory from the past by a resonance across time. I think our own normal psychological memories are not stored in our brains. I think our brain, we tune into them by morphic resonance. The standard theory, of course, is that they're stored in the brains as chemical traces or as modified synapses. People have been trying to find these traces for 100 years with almost no success. And I think that's because they're not there. I think we tune into them. For some reason, I think people, when they're dying, move into a different physiological state. And sometimes people, when they're dying, have a surge of energy. It's called the last rally, sometimes by nurses or people in hospices. And I recently published a paper. In fact, my most recent published paper is on end-of-life experiences with animals, based on hundreds of case studies of dying dogs, cats, and horses. And many of them show a similar surge of energy shortly before they die, called the last rally. Some vets call it that. Sometimes if they seem to have lost their memory, they, as far as we can tell, seem to have something a bit like terminal lucidity. I myself think that the evolutionary roots of this, because it seems widespread in animals, so we've got stories not just of dogs, cats, and horses doing this, but budgerigars, canaries, minor birds, parrots, and birds as well. I think the evolutionary background is that in many animal species, when animals are dying, they don't just die in the middle of the nest or in the middle of the community. They go off into the wilderness to die on their own, away from the rest. And in order to do that, an animal must first of all know it's dying, and secondly, have enough energy to be able to do it, to go somewhere else. And I suspect that there's some kind of evolutionary background to the last rally or this surge of energy. And I think terminal lucidity is one reflection of a bigger phenomenon. And the fact that it occurs in animals as well as in people makes me think that there's a much broader biological evolutionary basis for this, rather than it just being kind of fancy that, isn't that a strange thing, sort of just in humans. I think it's part of a bigger picture. And terminal lucidity, the very word, was only coined about 10 years ago. And it's a bit like when Raymond Moody coined the term near-death experience. They've been going on forever. Plato describes one in The Myth of which is in The Republic, his book, The Republic. So they've been going on forever, but when people give them a name, then you can sort of recognize it. And terminal lucidity has been going on forever. But now it's got a name, people are noticing it much more, and it's being studied. So I think another part of it is that the dying process, for many people, involves this transition of consciousness. And many people who've studied end-of-life experiences in hospices and so on say that often when people are dying, it's as if they're opening up to a bigger realm of consciousness. And preparing to go on absorbed into a larger consciousness. The materialist theory, of course, is that when you die, the brain stops functioning, it all just goes blank. But the traditional view in all societies and all religions is that death isn't the end, that consciousness continues in some way, and that death is a kind of transition. And in some ways, terminal lucidity can be seen as a transition, part of that transition, and dying consciously.
It's a good question, but we're going to have to move on, but thank you. Are there any students with questions? Okay, I'm coming to get you in the back. It was longer than I thought it was going to be.
Can you hear me?
Pardon?
Can you hear me from up here?
Sorry?
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can hear you, yes.
Okay. You've kind of referenced how your experiences with psychedelics have led you to a more spiritual state, and I was wondering whether you could elaborate more on what kind of things and sort of, yeah, just generally your experiences with spirituality and psychedelics.
Well, it's obviously a long story, but so I'll try and answer it briefly. When I was educated as a scientist, I went through the standard package deal of science equals atheism equals materialism. The mind's nothing but the brain, evolution's nothing but chance mutations and natural selection. The universe is purposeless, and so on. Religion's just a myth, God's just an idea in human minds, and therefore nothing more than an idea in human brains. I thought all that when I was a teenager and when I was an undergraduate and indeed a graduate student. And really, I think that what jolted me out of it was first traveling through India in 1968. I spent several months traveling in India. I went to work there in the 70s, but I first traveled through India and encountered cultures where people took very seriously the other realms of consciousness. And then my LSD experience really was very formative for me. And as a result of that, I got interested in consciousness and I took up transcendental meditation. And then later went and worked in India. I was meditating, I was doing yoga. So I was mostly drawn to Hindu forms of spirituality. In Hyderabad, where I lived, I had a Sufi teacher. And so I, for a year or two, had a Sufi practice, which I found really helpful. But all these exotic practices didn't really fit very well with my own upbringing and background. And I then got interested in something that was more in accordance with my own Christian upbringing. So I started praying again with the Lord's Prayer. And I started going to church. And I was actually confirmed in the Church of South India at the age of 34. And I then found a wonderful English monk, Father Bede Griffiths, who lived in a small Christian ashram in South India in Tamil Nadu, who was exactly the right person for me because he bridged the depths of the Hindu spiritual tradition with the Christian tradition and introduced me to the Christian mystical tradition that I had not known about before. I spent 2 years living in his ashram. I wrote my first book, A New Science of Life, about morphic resonance, living in a palm-thatched hut on the bank of a sacred river in his ashram, the River Cauvery in Tamil Nadu. And when I came back to England, I realized that all the things I so loved in India, the pilgrimages, holy places, sacred trees, all the things, the sacralization of the land, which is so strong in India, and the sacralization of nature. We have it all here. England's full of holy places, churches and cathedrals, full of holy chanting, like choral evensong in York Minster. And were all these pilgrimage places that we had in the Middle Ages when Pilgrimage was suppressed at the Protestant Reformation in 1538. Thomas Cromwell issued an injunction against pilgrimage. It was made illegal, and the monasteries were dissolved. They were the infrastructure for pilgrimage. But I realized you could do it. I started going on pilgrimages in England. And in fact, I helped start 10 years ago the British Pilgrimage Trust, which is reopening the ancient footpath pilgrimage routes in England. And it's now turning into there's a huge revival of pilgrimage going on all over Europe. Santiago de Compostela is the leading part of it in Spain. But now here in Britain, there are pilgrimage routes all over Britain. There are one-day pilgrimage routes to York, 5 or 6 miles through the countryside. There are ones you can do in 3 or 4 days. There's one from Melrose to Lindisfarne, the Lindisfarne, the Holy Island pilgrimage. There's a 20-day pilgrimage from Winchester to Canterbury, the old way. And so there are wonderful pilgrimages here. So really what's, for me, it's done is reconnected me with my own ancestral traditions here in England. And so I'm particularly interested in these Christian psychedelic movements. The Santo Daime Church, for example, I've been to several of their ceremonies in Brazil and elsewhere. For me, that ticks all the boxes. You know, it's about connection with nature, it's about the forest and the plants, and it's the patron saint of the Santo Daime Church is Our Lady, Queen of the Forest, a green form of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the ayahuasca is like the sacrament in that church. So I find that, for me, works very well. But on an ordinary day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis, whenever I go to a new town or city, I try and go to the church or the cathedral, or if it's a Muslim country, I go to the mosque or the shrine of a Sufi saint, or if it's India, I go to a temple. I go to the sacred place at the center and try and connect with that first, to link to the place and the tradition. And in Europe, it's usually a church or a cathedral. So I find that this, as a way of connecting, is really helpful. I also make a practice of going to church on Sundays wherever I am, which means when I'm staying with friends in the country, I go to village churches, and very often there's only 3 or 4 elderly people there. And I just feel, you know, what a shame if these churches, some of them are closing and will close. But what a loss it would be if we lose these sacred places at the heart of every community. The ancestors are buried around them. They've been there for centuries. They've been where the rites of passage of birth and marriage and death and baptism and so on have gone on for all these centuries. So I really value our own Christian heritage. I'm not saying it's the right path for everyone. And if I were a Muslim, I'd be a Muslim. If I come from a Muslim background, if I were an Indian, I'd be a Hindu. So I'm not saying it's the only path, but I think all religions are paths that lead beyond themselves to their divine source. And so I think one of the challenges for me, and I think generally culturally speaking, for those of us who come from Christian backgrounds, is to reconnect or re-find a way of relating to our own heritage.
That's a beautiful answer and a wonderful place for us to finish. Rupert, I cannot thank you enough for coming today, and we have, as a token of our appreciation, a small gift for you, which includes not only a couple of sweet things. I know you typically try to avoid sugar, but some of Betty's famous tea, because we all know that tea is better in the north. So a little something to take home with you. And also just to say, in terms of presence, I think you've brought everyone into presence here tonight with your talk, and thank you so much for being here. And also in terms of ways to go beyond, sometimes that's through mind-altering substances, but also sometimes that's through scientists, mentors, friends, people who really paved the way. You mentioned Amanda Fielding, but you are precisely up there as somebody who has enabled something like a drug science society and consciousness societies to exist and have inspired my own work. So thank you for that, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ruth.
Please join me in giving a round of applause.